Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Nick, and today I'm going to be covering the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Vanderhall Venice GT. Now, I've had this vehicle for about 4 months, and I can tell you that it hasn't been a 100% positive experience. But hold up, I'm not telling you not to buy a Vanderhall, but what I am telling you is there are some things you need to know prior to jumping into the pool. But before we get into this video, guys, make sure you do the 3 things. It really does help motivate me to keep putting content out, and I truly thank you guys that have already subscribed. And with that said, let's get into this.
Okay guys, first off I want to point out that I have a cold, so kind of bear with me as we go through this. If you don't know what a Vanderhall Venice is, I'm going to give you the abbreviated version right now, which is that it's a 3-wheeled vehicle or autocycle built by a company based out of Utah called Vanderhall Motorworks. They are a boutique motor vehicle company, and they put out a couple different variations of this vehicle, but we're mainly going to be talking about the Venice GT model that you see in front of you now. They have another model of this vehicle called the Carmel, and the main difference between this one and that one is that the Carmel has doors and a roof. They also have a fully electric version of this vehicle called the Edison, and on top of that they have a 4-wheel drive vehicle that is also fully electric that they're calling the Brawley. But like I said, we're mainly going to be focused on the Venice GT model that's in front of you. I will say that all of the autocycles, with the exception of the Edison, which is electric, all share the same GM-based 1.5 liter 4-cylinder motor, and they all share the same 6-speed automatic transmission. I also want to point out that earlier versions of this vehicle did have a 1.4 liter, but the 1.5 liter is around 194 horsepower and 203 foot-pounds of torque, and hits 0 to 60 in the 4.5 second range with the top speed right around 140. From there we'll move on to curb weight, and the curb weight is around 1,460 pounds. And the main reason I point this out is because you'll typically see this engine being used in something like a Chevy Equinox, which has a curb weight right around 3,500 pounds, and that's quite the weight difference between the two vehicles, and I thought that was significant to point out. I also want to point out the width and length of the vehicle. This is a pretty wide vehicle. It's 68.9 inches in width and 143.7 inches in length. The main reason I point this out is because if you're planning on trailering this vehicle or purchasing one, you're probably not going to be able to use your standard motorcycle trailer. Just something to keep in mind if you plan on buying one and picking it up with a trailer. So I told you I'm going to give you the good, bad, and ugly on this vehicle, and I want to start with the good. And I'm going to make an argument that this vehicle is practical. And I know that sounds funny because this is a 3-wheeled vehicle without a roof, but let me explain. If you compare this to a brand new Harley Davidson Bagger, it's about the same price. And when I tell people that, they're often surprised. And if you have a busy life with kids and a dog and a 9-to-5 job, and you want a recreational vehicle, the Venice actually makes a lot of sense. When you don't have kids or other real-life responsibilities, you can always find time to pull a motorcycle out your garage and take a ride. But as life gets busy, that's not always the case, and I found that the Venice is much more friendly for day-to-day use. You don't have to put on a helmet, a leather jacket, and boots to ride this thing. You can simply throw on a pair of flip-flops, jump in and take it for a ride and feel pretty safe. I mean, the GT model even has heated seats and a heater. If you've watched some of my other videos, you know that my daily driver is a Jeep Wrangler, but I can tell you that over the summer this Venice quickly became my primary mode of transportation, and that's because it's not a chore to get it out of the garage. I also feel comfortable putting my kids in it, and I can go pick up groceries because there's enough storage behind the seats and on the floorboard to do things like that. It's just friendly. And the suspension is softer than I would have guessed. It doesn't beat you up or punish your spine, and even if you forget about the rear tire being in the middle and you hit a pothole, it's manageable, and you quickly learn how to avoid things like that. As far as the steering, it's great. That is when it's working. I'll get into that in a minute. But 90-degree turns are sharp and precise, and it just has a real connection to the ground. Spirited driving in the Venice is a thrill. I really can't completely explain the feeling. Something about that open top and being so close to the ground as you cut through canyons. You could literally reach out the side and touch the pavement, although I don't recommend it. And cruising the vehicle has the same type of feeling. This isn't something that you feel like you have to drive balls to the walls all the time in order to get something out of it. It's really a unique experience. And if you're somebody that enjoys meeting new people, you've found your vehicle. I can't tell you how many times this vehicle started a conversation. I can't tell you how many times someone stopped me and asked me to take a picture in front of it. I was in a car wash one day and somebody stopped me to start a conversation. And as my time ticked away, I wasn't even upset because I'm simply impressed with how many heads this thing turns. In the state of Idaho, this is classified as an autocycle, meaning the rules are kind of mixed in between a motorcycle and a standard vehicle. For example, you don't have to have a helmet to drive one, and you also don't have to have a motorcycle license to drive one. So I gotta recommend that you check your state codes and statutes prior to making the decision to buying one. And for now, the last good thing I have on my list for you is the turbo sound of this vehicle. If you're not somebody that's keen on turbo sounds, this might not be a point of interest to you, but if you are, listen to this. This is just average driving in the Venice. So although there are a lot of positives to the Vanderhall Venice, it's not all puppy dogs and rainbows, which brings me to the bad. You see, their fit and finish isn't really what I would call up to par, especially in comparison to a company like Harley-Davidson. For example, the pinstriping on both sides of mine is already starting to come off, and I've only had it for about 4 months. But this isn't a huge deal to me. I can give them a pass here because I plan on just taking it off and replacing it with stuff that hopefully drives people to this channel. Another example is the gas cap. It seems like a really fancy gas cap, but I broke the mechanics of it the first week I had it, and then when I pried it apart to look inside, I found that it was just a really fancy piece of metal over a really cheap plastic GM style gas cap. I'm going to glue another one that I found into the cap and replace it, but I'm curious what Vanderhall and the dealership would have charged me had I tried to get the whole piece. Another example is the Bluetooth stereo. It's just not that great. I have a rather new phone and I can never get it to connect properly. And when I do get it connected, the change track and volume is the same function. You just hold it longer depending on what you want. And I always get them mixed up and end up blowing my ears out. Which brings me to the speakers. They're also not that great. They get distorted rather easily. At this point, I decided just to correct the issue with some Marine speakers and a Marine head unit I had kicking around the garage. I also found a very compact amp that I'm going to put in the storage compartment behind the seats that won't take up a lot of room. So if you want to see how that turns out, make sure you stay tuned to my channel. Now the fit and finish on the GT leather seats is awesome. I'm super impressed with these seats. However, they have zero lumbar. So as you can see, I got a couple pillows in there for lumbar support, and I'm going to be on the hunt for some nicer looking leather pillows that I can just leave in there that look a little better. One thing I want to mention is visibility, but not visibility from a driver's standpoint, because there's nothing you can't see in the driver's seat of this vehicle. I'm talking about other drivers. This thing sits super low to the ground, lower than if you were on a motorcycle, and I can see a scenario where if you pulled up to a stoplight and a large truck pulled up behind you, they may forget you're there and then pull forward and hit you. So, like a motorcycle, make sure you're planning your exit. Now that we got the good and the bad out of the way, I want to get into what I'm calling the ugly of this vehicle. And it's not really pertaining to the vehicle itself, it's more about what you might expect from a dealership or Vanderhall staff themselves. So I had some negative experiences with the dealership I used, and I just don't know how I feel about it at this point, so I'm not going to dime them out by name, because I don't believe in throwing people under the bus unfairly, and I think the issue has been resolved at this point, but I still think it merits talking about. So when I decided I wanted a Vanderhall, I wanted it spec'd out like the one I got. The problem was the dealership I was using didn't have that spec. However, they were able to find it at another dealer, and they had it driven down prior to me picking it up. The vehicle was dirty when I arrived, but I kind of just gave them a pass on it because of how they had got it down to the dealership. But when I got home, I noticed that there was a dent in the hood, which is still there today, and I thought that was pretty shady given the fact that I just bought a brand new vehicle. Anybody that truly knows me knows that I don't sweat the small stuff, so in the back of my mind I figured it wasn't a big deal, it wasn't worth my time bringing up. I'm a pretty handy guy, and I figured that one day I'd just modify the front end of the vehicle, and I'd just cover it up with maybe a hood scoop. No harm, no foul, not worth any further time invested. The second bad experience I had, I just couldn't look past. It happened during the first weekend that I had the vehicle, which just happened to be the 4th of July weekend. I was giving my nephews rides in the vehicle, and while I was giving one of them a ride, the power steering went out, and this caused me concern because had it happened in a corner that I couldn't have corrected it in, I could have potentially crashed the vehicle. So I got a hold of the dealership, and they had me bring in the vehicle, which I should add isn't right around the corner from my house. It's a ways away from where I live. And when I dropped it off, it sat there for about a week before they called me and told me that they couldn't recreate the issue. So I went and picked up the vehicle, and what stuck out in my mind is when I got there, it was completely filthy. It looked like they had just left it outside in the rain for the entire week and hadn't touched it. But again, I don't sweat the small stuff, so I picked it up and just hoped that the problem wouldn't happen again. I then took it on a ride with some other autocyclists all the way through Yellowstone and Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and again the problem consistently started to happen, and this was concerning because if you've ever been to Yellowstone, you know there's a lot of curvy roads that go off a lot of steep cliffs. It wasn't the power steering going out that concerned me the most. What concerned me the most is when it came back on in the middle of a curve on those curvy roads in Yellowstone, because then I'd have to play around with jerking it back so that I'd stay on the road. It wasn't the safest scenario. This is what drove it home to me that this was a serious issue. So again, I contacted the dealer, and this time I let them know how serious I felt about the issue, and they told me to bring it back in. So I did. And when I got there, it was kind of like they were just blowing me off and they thought it was funny. At least that's how I felt like they were treating me. And I'm a pretty good judge of character. Luckily, as I pulled into the dealership, the issue started happening again. So I was able to let one of them grab onto the steering wheel and move it around to see that was happening prior to me to turning the vehicle off and back on, showing them that it fixed itself at that point. I explained to him that I didn't want the vehicle back until the issue was resolved, and I also told him that I was going to contact Vanderhall directly, just so that I could cover my bases. I do want to point out that because I was on that Yellowstone trip, that the Venice was completely filthy, but I didn't bother cleaning it,
because what's the point? I figured in my mind that they'd just leave it outside for another week anyway. So true to my word, I went through the steps of contacting Vanderhall and advised them that what was going on. The lady I spoke to was nice enough and told me that she would be contacting the dealership directly. Ultimately, the dealership recontacted me and advised me that the issue had been resolved. And what I learned is that this vehicle has electronic power steering and that there was a loose ground wire, and when it came loose, the power steering would go off, and then when it reconnected, it would come back on. Now, although I'm a handy guy, I'm not a mechanic, but it seemed like a pretty fair explanation for what was going on, and the issue hasn't repeated itself, so I'm hopeful that it's been resolved for good. One thing that surprised me is that Vanderhall never recontacted me directly to see how the issue was resolved. However, I can't be too mad at them, because in the back of my mind I have a feeling that they contacted the dealership directly, and that's what ultimately got it resolved. I do have to add that when I picked up the vehicle the last time, I noticed that one of the bolts that secure the hood over the motor was unsecure and sticking out. I pointed this out to one of the mechanics. He walked over and pushed it in and acted like he had screwed it in, which he clearly didn't. When I got home, I pulled it out and I realized that the bracket inside that it screws into was no longer there. Again, I thought this was pretty shady. Now, although this situation was frustrating for me, I'm sure there's plenty of you out there that had nothing but positive experiences when purchasing your Vanderhall. I just had to be honest about mine. The truth is, I still love this vehicle. It's like stepping into a time machine. Every time I get in it, I go back in time, and it's just a visceral feeling that I can't explain. It's something that you have to experience on your own. So how do I wrap this all up? Well, I can tell you the one area where Vanderhall can improve, and that's in the pride department. They need to figure out a way to funnel pride from the CEO all the way down to the mechanic on the ground. I would never discourage anybody from owning a Vanderhall, but I had to warn you, if something goes wrong, there is a probability that you'll be on your own. But when everything's going right, there's nothing like it. See you next time.